Exactly 1 year ago today, Skull and Bones, the pirate-themed action-adventure game from Ubisoft Singapore, slammed ashore onto console and PCs everywhere as one of Ubisoft's most controversial recent releases, being critically panned by critics and audiences alike, and for some, showcasing just how out of touch the publisher had become. But in the new age of games as a service, even if you don't quite stick the landing, there's always the rare chance that it could all turn around. Think games like No Man's Sky or Cyberpunk 2077, each launching in similar states, disappointing fans with a plethora of bugs and lack of promised features. But in the years since release, both have evolved into some of the highest rated games of the last decade. But is Skull and Bones one of those success stories, or is it just the latest of Ubisoft's blunders? Well, today on Game Rant, we're going to be taking a look. Let's start by diving into where the game all started. Skull and Bones initially began production all the way back in 2013, as Ubisoft was coming off the acclaimed release of Assassin's Creed Black Flag, which Skull and Bones was initially developed as an expansion to, before quickly pivoting into its own MMO title. And this turbulence behind the scenes would continue for several years, undergoing multiple changes in scope and direction, with even its setting being shifted around the globe, from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, and then finally landing in East Africa. Although its eventual reveal at E3 in 2017 did provide a quick glimpse of light, as fans were intrigued by what many described as the best part of AC Black Flag pulled out and given its own title. However, that hype was short-lived, because the game was hit with nothing but delay after delay, as it was pushed back from a 2018 release date to 2019, 2020, skipping over 2021 and going straight to 2022, then 2023, and eventually settling on the real, actual release date, final for real this time, of February 16th, 2024. However, even with a locked date, Skull and Bones still couldn't stay away from bad press, as just weeks before release on an earnings call, when asked about the steep $70 price of the game, Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot stated that Skull and Bones is really a full quadruple A game that will deliver in the long run. A statement that the gaming community latched onto and ran with, as the idea of a quadruple A title is a little absurd. So the term quadruple A became the game's unofficial tagline in the community, setting it up before release to be held to an impossibly high standard. And unfortunately, when it did finally release in February, as you may have gathered by now, it was less well received as one would hope after nearly a decade of development and with an alleged budget of over $650 million. Early sales figures told us that the game sold significantly worse than their biggest competitor in the pirate subgenre, Sea of Thieves, which released way back in 2018 during Skull and Bones' initial release window. And a week after its release, prominent leaker Tom Henderson published an article claiming that the game had amassed only 850,000 total players during its first week, which may sound like pretty decent numbers. But for the world's first quadruple A MMO, it wasn't quite what they were hoping for, especially taking into account that this number also includes those playing via free trials. Review-wise, Skull and Bones was averaging just 57% from top critics, and was getting an even worse reception from players. The biggest drawbacks to the title seem to stem from a lot of the live service and grind-focused mechanics, with the game seeming to focus more on creating busy work for the player over providing engaging pirate adventures. In fact, the general overall vibe from many critics and players was that of just boredom. Ubisoft had delivered a game that wasn't spectacularly bad, but it also wasn't very great either. Among the positive reviews, however, you had people praising its stellar core gameplay features, like sailing and naval combat, as well as commenting on the game's visuals, which definitely impress. However, many reviewers, even those who rated the game positively, did so with the caveat that the game was a solid base and likely to change and evolve over the years, as Ubisoft had lofty post-launch plans for the game's first year, including 4 seasons of content, with new battles, events, and rewards for taking part. But now, let's fast forward a year and check back in on Skull and Bones today. And now personally, I just jumped into this game for the first time this week, with the explicit goal of answering the question, is it actually that bad in 2025? And to be honest, I think it still is. So much of the game, or at least the opening hours of it, revolve around following a waypoint to a specific area, fighting in a ship battle, looting the wreckage, and then returning back to base to turn the quest in. It's quite literally the definition of a fetch quest, and one that you do over and over again. And while visually, things like the water and the ship physics look incredible, I found the gameplay itself to be overly restrictive. In other pirate games, like the aforementioned Sea of Thieves, you have free control over your captain at all times, and can jump aboard enemy vessels, physically patch up walls, and even engage in sword fights and other combat on foot, as opposed to Skull and Bones, where you're effectively just playing as a ship the whole time. Even boarding other boats will just trigger a cutscene and an item selection screen. And while the naval combat itself is satisfying, it feels like only a part of a game rather than the one and only feature, which makes sense given this game's history as a part of a much bigger, more diverse game. But in terms of content they've added over the past year, they're currently deep into their 4th and final season, and is actually rumored to be on the cusp of revealing Year 2 content in the coming weeks as we roll past the anniversary. All this despite the only publicly available player numbers coming from Steam only showing a 24-hour peak of 150 players max on any given day, a far cry from the already low numbers of only 2,000 or so from its initial Steam release back in August. However, it is worth noting that these are only Steam's numbers, and that the game was originally only available via the Epic Store, meaning a majority of the player base could be there or on console, where accurate player numbers are harder to verify. And in fact, according to an article published by Insider Gaming back in December, talking about the potential for a Year 2, an anonymous source is quoted saying that the actual player numbers might surprise people, with the article then going on to report that Ubisoft are even exploring premium crossover events in the future, including one potentially revolving around the Assassin's Creed Black Flag remake that's also heavily rumored. But it still remains to be seen if that or any of the Year 2 leaks actually come to fruition. Regardless though, it would appear that Ubisoft must be making some kind of return on investment on the live service game, whether through microtransactions or new purchases, now that the game has dropped significantly from its $70 price point down to just $40. Putting it more in line with what critics have said that it's worth. But this is especially surprising given Ubisoft's recent canceling of XDefiant, a free-to-play shooter that reportedly was losing players at an alarming rate, despite a mostly positive reception at its launch. But as for Skull and Bones' place in the industry, it's more or less forgotten about, as even within Ubisoft there are bigger games, and frankly, bigger controversies to focus on, like the aforementioned shutdown of XDefiant and the critical reception to Assassin's Creed Shadows, resulting in its various delays. But these numbers and Ubisoft's willingness to continue investing in the title could be indicative that while the player base isn't quite the biggest, the fans that have latched onto the title are devoted. And you can almost see the tide shift in places like Steam reviews, where we've officially moved into mostly positive recent reviews territory, although with a significantly smaller amount of reviews. So it's possible that those who disliked the game simply stopped playing, and all that's left at this point are the very few but devoted Skull and Bones fans, leaving the game in 2025 sitting about where it was for most of 2024, mostly forgotten about and written off by the majority of gamers. And while its price drop may be enough to win over some pirate game enthusiasts who just want to get more immersed in the game's stellar atmosphere and ship battles, the year worth of post-launch events hasn't done much of anything to rectify the tedium and boredom that many players felt during launch week. All of that said though, it is still possible that with the rumored Year 2 content, they could pull out all the stops and really turn this thing around. But given Ubisoft's current track record and the game's lack of players by all metrics that we're privy to, I wouldn't necessarily hold your breath. And that'll about do it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and for more deep dives like this, check out GameRant.com.